There's a few things you can look at. The one is considering the incentives. So, are they trying to sell something that is shady when they're giving you information? Are they saying stuff that is going to get them a lot of views versus necessarily being good information? So considering incentives is one, and how the person gets paid for the information they give you. Considering someone's experience and education in the space and whether you can verify that education and experience. It's funny how many TikTokers you come across who will say, as an ex hedge fund manager, and they look like they're 20 years old. And it's like, okay, well, I don't know how verifiable that is, but, is it easy to verify the information? And the third thing is, and actually, I think I'm borrowing this from the CFA study that I talked about earlier, because they highlight some recommendations for the space. But the third one is the information easy to see elsewhere? Is it consistent with other sources? Basically saying, can you cross-check the information to verify it? And I think the biggest benefit of social media is to learn about the concepts of investing rather than to use social media to get your stock picks. It's like the teach a man to fish versus giving him a fish. And I think there are a lot of issues with kind of just getting stock picks from social media. But if you're someone who wants to invest in individual stocks, there's a common saying of do your own research. And I take that quite literally. I think you should not invest in individual stocks that you're pulling from recommendations of whether it be a finfluencer or even someone on CNBC who's talking about the next big AI stock or whatever. I think you see the same issues with stock picks in newer methods of media versus older channels. So I think what's more important is focusing on people who teach the concepts rather than the stock picks. I think there's room to talk about stock research and stuff. And I even highlight to a lot of people, I talk to a lot of students in finance, and I say, like, if you're comfortable doing so, I say post your amateur research online and get feedback on it. So long as you highlight that's amateur research. So I think there's a benefit to sharing information and getting feedback and using social media to do research in some avenues. But when you find someone who's saying that this position's giving these promises of a position that's going to 10x or has the potential to 10x and kind of, giving essentially what's a get rich quick scheme, but stock version, I think that's a red flag that you should be looking elsewhere.
It's a nice thought that the cream will rise to the top, that people will ignore the sensationalism and they'll cut through things. But you talk about incentives. We know the incentives are so high for people who scam people. Do you think the regulators need to step in? Do you think there's a world where it can be regulated or should be regulated in any way?
It's tough because I think there's room for regulation. I think it has to be done properly, and I wouldn't say I'm the expert to to consult on that. I think there's room for some regulation in terms of marketing. When it comes to, and I think we've seen a bit of a crackdown in some areas. I know there have been some courses that have been charged, at least in the United States, for overpromising and things like that. But I think there needs to be, again, an alignment of incentives where, or some form of putting accountability on people for the things they claim online, where if someone claims that their course is going to make you rich or something like that, that there's a tangible form of accountability for that. Because I think the issue is that a lot of people use sort of general terms to kind of beat around the bush and dodge whatever laws do exist. And I think the laws we currently have also give a lot of exemptions based on historical cases that aren't really applicable to today. So in the United States, for example, the whole financial advice regulation, you see a lot of people, they'll post, here are my top 10 stocks to pick, # not financial advice. What's funny in the United States is that the law, seemingly the precedent that's ruling over whether people, like that allows people to effectively post online and share any sort of financial advice they want, is an old case that revolved around a newsletter that someone was disseminating. And basically they argued that a newsletter is not a form of financial advice because it's too general. It's not considering an individual. It's not going up to John and saying, John, I think you should buy this stock. You're sending out a general recommendation. But that set the precedent where you might not be able to tell one person to buy stock, but technically telling a whole crowd of people to buy a stock is not considered financial advice in the United States. So I think there needs to be sort of a fine tuning of laws to consider those gaps that have existed based on old precedent. But it's tough to say what the right approach is, right? And I think it has to be a gradual movement towards figuring out what the right balance there is. Because I think if you go too far, you crack down a bit too intensely. And I was speaking to, there's a channel, New Money in Australia. And Australia has been an area where there's been more of a crackdown in terms of requiring finfluencers to actually get a degree of registration before they post any sort of finance content online. So I don't know if that's the right approach, but I think it's an area that shows kind of the dichotomy of less regulation like you see in the United States, for example, versus a more intense regulatory framework, and then comparing, well, how does that affect the areas that we're observing?
Yeah, and it's also you said that the traditional world has issues because it's regulated and that creates incentives and needs to have clients with certain levels of capital. And then on the other hand, you've got someone like Kramer or some, like you've got CNBC say where people are literally talking about individual companies all the time. So I don't think it's just an influencer or finfluencer in the sense of, YouTubers and TikTokers. It's a whole financial media question, I would say, broadly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the exact same laws we look to apply to finfluencers need to apply to the oldest finfluencers we have, which are the the CNBC talking heads and things of that sort. And, especially when it comes to that, like you have issues with conflicts of interest and things like that. So I think part of it is cracking down on disclosures and enforcing disclosures as well, where if you have a position, like if you're going to talk about finances, there's more clear disclosure about where your interests are. And if there's regulation around, if you're a part owner in a business, you should disclose that if you're giving stock picks about that position. It's definitely something that needs to be applied on all fronts fairly.
I think, or if you're taking like a backhandle, you're like, buy this stock or buy this crypto and they're giving you that crypto, you should have to declare it.
I've seen that, right?
I see it all the time.
On YouTubers, they talk about, they're like, it's sponsored by this oil company, and then there's an SEC declaration that they've got paid 10 grand to mention it. I'm like, this is super odd. They're like literally talking about a random oil miner or oil discovery business and then declaring how much they got paid. So it does exist.
It's, what's interesting is in Canada too, the few times I've seen a YouTube video sponsored by a publicly traded stock, meaning that they're quite literally saying this video is brought to you by ticker whatever, like here's why you should invest, have been for oil, gas, and mining companies.
Yeah.
And it's very bizarre.
It's always the exploration stuff as well, which is kind of like flip of a coin, right? They've got some good leads.
Well, yeah, that's it. It's a high risk industry, very capital intensive and high risk, which to me, it's whether you would call it fraudulent is questionable, but it's definitely very sketchy in the sense of, it's similar to cryptocurrency marketing, where it's like, well, we have the potential to do really well, and here's why you should invest. But they don't often have a solid business, which is probably why they're advertising on YouTube.
That was a short clip from our full interview with finance legend Richard Coffin from The Plain Bagel. You can check out the full interview right here.